gentlemen, tonight's closing plenary session of the 13th Conference of the European Sociological Association will begin in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm in a pleasant position I'm delighted to coordinate the closing plenary. We finally came to the end of this exciting conference. And the closing plenary has a particular focus on unmaking subjectivities. But before we start the closing plenary with the two distinguished speakers, I would like to make an announcement. I would like to bring to your attention the forthcoming International Sociological Congress of 2018 in Toronto, Canada. It's the 19th, if I remember well, the ESA World Congress of Sociology. The theme of the Congress is very relevant to some aspects of this conference here. It's power, violence, and justice, reflections, responses, and responsibilities. It's in July 2018. The president of the International Sociological Association, Margaret Abraham, is, I think she's somewhere in the front, in the audience. She's since the beginning of the conference here in Athens, and she's in this closing plenary. Margaret, are you here? Okay. Okay. I think that's to encourage colleagues to participate in the International Sociological Association conference too. Okay. This closing plenary has two speakers, both of whom are well-known intellectuals in their specific scientific domains. Both of them have contributed to current discussions and dialogues on human subjectivities from different points of view. We are happy to have them here tonight. The first speaker is Wendy Brown. I will say a few words about her, and I will call her to the lectern. She's a class of 1936 first professor of political science. She's a political scientist and a core faculty in the program for critical theory at the University of California, Berkeley. She received many fellowships. The current one is in Guggenheim Fellow. Short reference to her work. Probably many of you are acquainted with her work. She has established new paradigms in critical legal studies and feminist theory. She has produced a body of work drawing from Marx, Nietzsche, Weber, Freud, Foucault. And Wendy Brown's work aims to diagnose modern and contemporary formations of political power and to discern the threats to democracy entailed by various formations. Wendy Brown's thinking on the decline of sovereignty and the hollowing out of democracy has found particular audiences and also journalistic audiences, with discussions of her arguments appearing in The Guardian and the New York Times. That's important for the academics to have wider audiences, and that's important. So sometimes titles of her books are States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity, Edgework, Critical Essays on Knowledge and Politics, Regulating Aversion, Tolerance in the Age of Identity and Empire, World States, Waning Sovereignty, and the recent one, Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution. 3 of her books have been translated into Greek, And Wendy Brown's work has been translated in more than 20 languages, and she has received many awards. Having said all of that, I would like to call Wendy Brown onto the lectern. Wendy.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful space in Athens, in Greece, and among thoughtful sociologists. What I want to consider tonight is a few of the tributaries that foment, form, and legitimate right-wing energies as they erupt across the Euro-Atlantic today. The terms commonly bandied about to describe this eruption, populism, authoritarianism, neo-fascism, strike me as inadequately capturing the strange brew of bellicosity, disinhibition, and anti-democratic freedom and statism taking shape. These terms, populism, authoritarianism, neo-fascism, eclipse the specific elements of neoliberal reason, a radically extended reach of the private, a normalization of inequality and exclusion that is organizing these angry, white, right political passions. And they do not capture the deep nihilism, making values into playthings, truth inconsequential, and the future a matter of indifference or worse, an unconscious object of destruction. My specific questions are these. What novel iterations and expressions of freedom have been wrought from the conjuncture of neoliberal reason, aggrieved white male power, and unavowed nihilism? How has freedom become the calling card of a formation heralding illiberal democracy in its attacks on equal rights, civil liberties, constitutionalism, and basic norms of tolerance and inclusion? And illiberal democracy's affirmations of white nationalism, strong statism, and authoritarian power? How and why have freedom and illiberalism, freedom and authoritarianism, freedom and legitimized social exclusion and social violence become fused in our time? To pursue these questions, I'm going to draw from the unlikely theoretical trio of Friedrich Hayek, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Herbert Marcuse. Hayek for the logics, Nietzsche for the social energies, and Marcuse for the psychic ones. As most in this room know, neoliberal thought was born in the shadow of European fascism and Soviet totalitarianism. Whatever their significant epistemological and ontological differences, the ordoliberal, Freiburg, and Chicago school thinkers shared the conviction that these dark formations, fascism and totalitarianism, were on a continuum with the pervasive social planning and state-managed political economies of their time. Keynesian welfare states, social democracy, publicly owned industries, all of these appear on the so-called road to serfdom. But all also represent the danger of politics interfering with individual liberty and the spontaneous order of interdependence and need provision that liberty is presumed to generate. Why politics? Why is politics the enemy? For Friedman, the twin threat of politics to freedom rests in its inherent concentration of power, which he presumes markets disperse, and its coercion by rule or dictate, while markets feature choice. Acknowledging that some measure of political power is indispensable for stable, secure societies, and even for the existence and health of markets, Friedman considered every political mandate to be a subtraction from individual freedom. Even democracy compromises freedom as it imposes the will of the majority on the minority. Markets, by contrast, always allow individual preferences to prevail, the equivalent of always getting what one votes for. Hayek, too, regarded political life as compromising individual liberty and the spontaneous order and progress that it generates when it's disciplined, hence responsibilized by competition. For Hayek, liberty is the absence of intentional human coercion. Nothing more, nothing less. Hayek rejects every other meaning of liberty. He's especially hostile to those that flirt with capacity or the power to act, the idea of freedom too. He's also hostile to the idea of freedom equated with popular sovereignty. More than wrong, these meanings of freedom are dangerous in Hayek's view, insofar as they lead to an enlarged sense of entitlement and thus to state control in the form of resource distribution and social planning. Put strongly, freedom pursued or practiced apart from its liberal market sense, this includes all left emancipation projects, inevitably inverts into freedom's opposite. It's both oppressive and socially devitalizing. Now, the root principle here is familiar from Adam Smith, but Hayek has significantly both modified and expanded its purview. As Foucault notes, the modification replaces exchange with competition as the engine of spontaneous order and development. And this means that competition must be installed in every domain and instilled in every subject. The expansion posits market liberty as a comprehensive ontological and normative principle. All society is like a market and best organized as a market, and all liberty, personal, political, social, civic, has a market form. This expansion is what builds an economic theory into a social and political one. The same kind of freedom, according to Hayek, ought to prevail everywhere and is capable of producing the same positive effects everywhere. Liberty generates responsibility, responsibility generates discipline, discipline generates social innovation, efficiency, order, and progress. A theory, then, and eventually a form of ubiquitously governing reason that's both ontological and normative, an account of who we are and how our arrangements and institutions ought to be organized. The normative dimension animates the neoliberal constructivist project to extend market principles everywhere and make them the governing principles of state and society. But how does this normative project take hold? How are market principles expanded? And conversely, how is the reach and power of politics pulled back, leashed, confined, contained, reduced? The familiar answer is that this happens by privatizing public goods and responsibilizing subjects. This is the explicit mission of Thatcherism and Reaganism in the 80s and 90s, and all neoliberal governance since, including, of course, all austerity mandates. But privatization works at only one end of the problem that neoliberals aim to solve. Eliminating blockades to freedom by eliminating government ownership, responsibilizing subjects and families, by dismantling public provisions. Less attended to, but more important for our purposes, is Hayek's concern with expanding the reach and claim of what Hayek himself calls the personal protected sphere. Here, individual self-care is not the driving aim. Rather, this project of freedom, expanding the personal protected sphere, involves designating more and more activity as private, hence appropriately unregulated, and appropriately shielded from democratic norms. In Hayek's words, the recognition of property is but the first step in delimiting the private sphere that protects us against coercion. But, he adds, we mustn't think of this sphere consisting exclusively or even chiefly of material things. Rather, this sphere, this personal sphere that he seeks to expand, gives us protection against interference with our actions by walling out coercion, especially that major coercive power, the state, but also by walling out coercion through broadly diffused democratic norms such as equality, inclusion, access, social justice, and even civility towards strangers. The zone, the claims, the objects of the personal are thus expanded to contest the domain and power of liberty's enemy, the political. This, as much as privatization of the public, is how the Hayekian bête noire, named society or the social, gets dismantled. This form of privatization, however, does more than expand individual rights for persons and to corporations, though it certainly does that. Extending the reach of the personal protected sphere, eliminating the idea of the social, curtailing the reach of the political, transforms public spaces heretofore organized by democratic law and norms. Expanding the personal protected sphere challenges the principles of equality, secularism, pluralism, and inclusion at the very heart of modern democratic society, and invites their replacement by what Hayek himself termed the traditional moral values of the personal protected sphere. Consider in this regard, for example, in the United States, the campaign to replace public funding of education with voucher systems, allowing families to choose schools for their children that comport closely with their values and reject schools that do not. Consider court rulings permitting business owners to impose religious convictions on their employees by withholding health insurance coverage for certain forms of contraception, or impose religious convictions on their customers by refusing service to those they regard as violating divine law. Or consider the increasingly open identification of Western nations with Christianity in centrist as well as right-wing political discourse, and the compromise of a secular, open public sphere that this identification entails. More broadly, expanding the private, reducing the social, curtailing the political in the name of freedom makes possible a new imago and a new ethos of the nation itself. An imago and an ethos that rejects a public, pluralistic, secular, democratic national order for an owned, homogeneous, familial one. The former features commitments to modest openness, diversity, rule of law, pluralism. The latter is exclusionary, walled, homogeneous, unified, hierarchical, and authoritarian. In other words, neoliberal economic privatization subverts democracy by generating inequality, private ownership of the commons, plutocracy, and a profoundly dimmed democratic imaginary. But this second vector of privatization, this expansion of the personal sphere, subverts democracy with anti-democratic moral values rather than anti-democratic capital values. It wages familial, traditionalistic, or tribalistic rather than market warfare on democratic principles and institutions. It generates exclusion, patriarchalism, tradition, nepotism, and Christianity as legitimate challenges to inclusion, autonomy, equal rights, limits on conflict of interest, and secularism. Moreover, while both kinds of privatization occur under the rubric of expanding freedom, the second is especially important in generating the political formation of an authoritarian freedom today, and this for two reasons. First, the content of the personal protected sphere that it seeks to expand is, as I've suggested, hierarchy, homogeneity, authority, exclusion. This is the nature of the home. Second, as this sphere grows, eventually enveloping the nation itself, securing and protecting it requires robust statism in the form of law, policing, and defense. And here it's important to avoid being blinded by the language of rights. Rights attached to individuals are the flying wedge with which democratic commitments to equality, civility, and inclusion are being cleared by neoliberal reason. But the force behind these rights, staging incursions against the public, the political, and the democratic, are values and claims of the market on the one hand, and heteropatriarchal Christian familialism on the other hand. In each case, rights are being strategically redeployed from their intended attachment to abstract individuals to something else: corporations and property, capital, wealth, but also whiteness, maleness, families, churches. It's also the combination of economic and familial privatization of the public that makes legible the growing right-wing attack on social justice as tyrannical or even fascist. Hayek himself famously decried the term social justice as what he called incoherent but also dangerous. He decried the practice as, quoting him, animated by a dangerous superstition, destructive of the indispensable environment in which traditional moral values can flourish namely personal freedom. And the alt-right in the United States today attacks what they have termed social justice warriors with the same venom once used against communist subversives as enemies of our way of life. Why the hyperbole? The charge is not just that these social justice projects serve egalitarian rather than libertarian ends, a cardinal sin in any neoliberal playbook. It's not just that they impose a political vision of the good society, social engineering or social planning, where there should only be liberty and competition. It's not just that they're political interventions, regulatory or redistributive, where achievement and reward should be organized solely by markets. It's not just that they suppress creative energies of free individuals and the spontaneous order that these energies yield. And it's not just that they limit the entitlement of families and churches to influence, if not control, the civic life and discourse of neighborhoods, towns, and nations. Rather, these wrongs are sculpted together into a figure of the political antichrist within a Hayekian formulation of freedom that valorizes and expands the private to challenge the power of the political. Combining the empowerment of the private and the familial with the disintegrative force of deregulation generates, of course, a powerful assault on social bonds, social cares, and social cooperation, literally bringing into reality the principle that there is, quote, no such thing as society. As bellicose ego distension of the individual, the family, and the group are legitimated, this novel form and force of freedom challenges norms of civility, inclusion, universality, and equality with norms of acceptable exclusions, partiality, and supremacy. As the social is attacked and dismantled, and the prejudices of the personal along with traditional family values are together unleashed in a deregulated public sphere, this unleashing is legitimated and practiced as rights-bearing freedom. I want to be very clear here. I'm not claiming that Hayek or other neoliberal intellectuals imagined or advocated for the strikingly disinhibited, often vicious, sexism, misogyny, racism, xenophobia, Muslim hating, and homophobia gushing from the extreme right today. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that neoliberalism's assault on the social and challenge to equality and democracy framed and legitimated energies that are emanating from a different set of concrete neoliberal effects, namely the declining hegemony of men, of whites, of Christianity, and of nation-states themselves. These energies of aggrieved power are variously expressed: rancor, resentment, rage, frustration. They have varied targets: politicians, elites, the EU, immigrants, liberals, blacks, Muslims, feminists, Jews. But importantly, they have no legitimate political form in a liberal democratic order, which is why they remained on the political fringe until recently. Neoliberalism's assault on egalitarianism, social provision, social justice, politics, and democracy, and its extension of the values and voices of the personal protected sphere is what I'm suggesting has given them that legitimate form. So we're dealing with what Stuart Hall would call a conjuncture, or what Foucault would term a contingent genealogical formation. In this conjuncture, conservative social values and the supremacies they secured become newly energized as a program of rejecting the tyrannical political program of the left in the name of freedom. At the same time, corporations and individuals alike mobilize deregulation claims to dismantle equality claims, and they mobilize competition claims to dismantle inclusion claims. And nationalist calls to wall out refugees and expel immigrants draw upon a figure of the nation itself as an endangered household where principles of democratic justice and human rights don't apply. Now we can readily comprehend one of the more perplexing features of the current landscape, namely how the right can be both the party of freedom and nationalism, freedom and protectionism, personal liberty and traditional social values. When the twin model of privatization we've been considering extends to the nation itself, the nation ceases to be figured as a democracy, and it's striking that Trump and Le Pen and Farage and Wilders and others very rarely utter the word democracy. Rather, the nation comes to be alternately rendered as a competitive business needing to make better deals, or as an inadequately secured home flooded by ill-willed or non-belonging outsiders. And a lot of right-wing nationalism oscillates between the two or combines them. Consider Trump's continuous braying about America's history of bad international deals on everything from trade to NATO to climate accords. But consider also his depiction of the United States as savaged by its unsecured borders and the need to wall in the homeland. Marine Le Pen, too, conjoined the two languages of privatization, economic and familial, to depict France. Quote, "We are the owners of our country," she declared at rallies, "and we must have the keys to open the House of France, to open it halfway, or to close the door." "It is our house," her crowds chanted back. When the nation itself is privatized and familialized in this way, principles of equality, universality, and openness are jettisoned. The nation becomes legitimately illiberal toward aversive insiders and invading outsiders. And statism, policing, and authoritarianism ramify, since walling and securitization of every kind are authorized by the need to secure this vast expanse of the private and deregulated freedom. As society is dismantled, nothing remains but market freedoms and state powers of securitization. Et voila, 21st century authoritarianism in freedom's name. But to this point, I've been considering a logic of governing reason, including its rollout in law and policy, but by itself, this logic doesn't generate the populist and nationalist movements hell-bent on whitening nations, walling out immigrants and refugees, vilifying feminists, queers, liberals, leftists, intellectuals, and even mainstream journalists. It doesn't by itself generate rancorous rage, disinhibition, and other antisocial passions. The important force in making these, of course, is not neoliberal reason, but neoliberal policy effects, especially those devastating the viability of white, middle, and working class existence in rural and suburban regions. Inchoately, until right-wing nationalist party platforms made it coate, many dethroned working and middle-class whites in Europe and North America sensed a connection between the decline of nation-state sovereignty, their own declining well-being, and declining white male supremacy. And of course, they're right. Undone by offshored union factory jobs, dismantled welfare states, disappearing affordable housing, and unprecedented global movements of labor and capital, the age of the secure white male provider and the age of nation-state sovereignty are largely finished. This condition cannot be reversed, but it can be politically instrumentalized. Here, the hyperbolic figure of the immigrant is especially potent. The terrorist fuses with the job stealer, the criminal, the refugee, and conversely, false promises of restored economic potency mix with false promises of restored racial, gender supremacy. Yet it's a mistake to see white working and middle-class men as uniquely injured by neoliberal policy or neglected by neoliberal politicians. This common reproach in both the Brexit campaign and the Hillary Clinton campaign by mainstream liberal pundits, that it focused too much on identity politics and gave short shrift to the white working class, this misses the extent to which the displacement suffered by whites is not mainly economic, and why, therefore, right-wing politicians can get away with doing nothing concrete for their constituencies as long as they verbally anoint their wounded whiteness with anti-immigrant, anti-black, and anti-globalization rhetoric. Whether targeting multiculturalists, political elites, liberal academics, refugees, feminists, or black activists, right-wing rage today is fueled by the dethroned entitlement of whites, especially white men across class. Rage against political correctness, social justice, social democracy, and even formal inclusion and equality is animated by the resentments of aggrieved power and entitlement. By themselves, neither neoliberal expansions of the private nor neoliberal devastations of economic and political security generate the ferocious energies of racist nationalism and the freedom cry through which it is released into the political libidosphere. The master philosopher of aggrieved power, of course, is Nietzsche. There is, to begin with, his account of how suffering, especially the suffering of humiliation, when routed through ressentiment, becomes moralizing condemnation of the object it holds responsible. In his formulation of what he called slave morality, Nietzsche focused mainly on the pious self-valorization of the weak and their moralizing denunciation of the powerful. But Nietzsche recognized that slave morality was also practiced by what he called bombastic haters, anti-Semites, racists. He diagnosed the swagger and the slugging of such types as part of what he called the reactive feelings, grudges, and rancor. Mobbism, bullying, bellicosity. Nietzsche castigated these grievous, resentful energies as opposite to the self-overcoming, proud, world-making energies of the powerful and the creative he sought to affirm. Now, certainly ressentiment is a vital energy of the right today. Rancor, grudges, barely concealed victimization, other affects of reaction are the affective heartbeat of internet trolling, tweets, speeches. They're a striking feature of the US president's own demeanor and discourse. But Nietzsche's most important contribution to theorizing the current conjuncture, I think, is his treatment of nihilism. Often mischaracterized as a nihilist because he reckoned with the contingent nature of values and truth, Nietzsche is more properly understood as a philosopher of the age of nihilism, the age that unfolds after science and reason topple God and shatter the foundations of every moral and ethical truth. Importantly, for Nietzsche, this age does not entail the elimination of values. Rather, it heralds a world in which, as Nietzsche put it, the highest values devaluate themselves as they become unmoored from their foundations. Western Judeo-Christian values, including those securing liberal democracy, lose their depth as they lose their fundaments. So they don't vanish. They become fungible, trivial, easily traded, augmented, instrumentalized, superficial. These effects, of course, further degrade the value of values, inevitably deepening the nihilism of cultures and their subjects. In addition to values, both truth and reason lose their moorings in a nihilistic age. Truth, still hoisted, ceases to require evidence or even reasoning. Convictions are increasingly detached from faith and immune to argumentation. They barely conceal their emanation from impulse or outrage. Exemplified by the British tabloids whipping up Brexit support, nihilism's most notorious expression today is probably Trump's manifest indifference to truth, consistency, and even political or moral convictions. That most Trump supporters and right-wing media share this indifference simply underscores the nihilistic character of the age. Extreme right politics embodies another important feature of nihilism as Nietzsche depicts it, one crucial to freedom's antisocial qualities today, and this is the desublimation of the will to power. Both Freud and Nietzsche understand values and the world built to comport with them as sublimations of what Freud called the instincts or drives and what Nietzsche termed the will to power. Both Freud and Nietzsche understood the untamed animal to be freer, in some ways happier, in the absence of such sublimation, but also at risk of self and other destruction. Above all, both understood civilization itself to be sublimation's product. With nihilism's devaluation of values, there is, Hans Sluga argues, a falling back and collapse of the will to power into its own elementary form. Even religion and the appeal to religious values become cynical instruments for the unrestrained use of power. More is at stake in this collapse than power unbridled by ethics or humility. Rather, Sluga writes, what goes by the way in this unrestrained will to power is any concern for others, in particular, the compact between generations on which our entire social order has rested so far. So through Sluga, Nietzsche helps us understand an aspect of right-wing freedom unyoked from conscience, not just because it's contoured by neoliberal selfishness and critiques of the social, but because of nihilism's own disintegration, if not suspension, of conscience. The result, freedom to do and say anything without regard for its effects, freedom to be without care for the predicaments or fate of other humans or species or the planet, freedom, as Nietzsche put it, to wreak one's will for the pleasure of doing so. At times, even festive freedom, manifest in the pleasures of provocation and piling on, humiliating others or making them suffer, dancing at the bonfires of what one is burning down. Again, this glee was manifest in some Brexiters. It's ubiquitous in right-wing blogs and trolling. It can be spied in the delight in making liberals and so-called snowflakes writhe or squirm. However, festivals of freedom at the burning down of civilization or the future of the planet is still not the worst of the matter. Rather, in this consequential turn, freedom abandons all affinity with political self-determination found in Rousseau, Tocqueville, or Marx. Freedom departs the categorical imperative of Kant. It's untethered from even Mill's cultivation of individuality and advancement of civilization, and even leaves behind Bentham's binding of liberty to utilitarian calculations. Instead, nihilistic disintegration of ethical values combined with neoliberalism's overtaking of the social with the personal generates a freedom that is furious, passionate, and destructive, reeking of ethical destitution, even as it sometimes dresses in conservative righteousness. This freedom is paradoxically expressed as nihilism and against nihilism. It faults its objects of derision for the ruin of traditional values and order, while attacking and destroying all the bonds of civilization and foundations for a future. It's freedom unbridled and uncultured, freedom to put a stick in the eye of accepted norms, freedom from care of the morrow, joyous in its provocations, animated by aggrieved, vengeful attacks on those it holds responsible for its own suffering or displacement. It's the freedom of the I will because I can, and I can because I am nothing. I believe in nothing, and the world has become nothing. This is the freedom remaindered by nihilism. It's been in the making for centuries. It's embodied in neoliberal reason itself, of course, which abandons human action based on a moral compass and posits no value apart from that generated by price and speculative markets. Not quite a century after Nietzsche wrote, Herbert Marcuse considered desublimation from a different angle, to theorize the non-liberatory release of what he called instinctual energies following Freud in post-war capitalism. What Marcuse famously termed repressive desublimation occurs in an order of capitalist domination, exploitation, and false needs as technology reduces the demands of necessity and desire is everywhere incorporated into a commodity culture enjoyed by a growing middle and even working class. This order features plenty of pleasure, including that obtained by radically reduced strictures on sexuality. Less grueling work requires less sublimation, but it does not feature emancipation. Instinctual energies, rather than being directly opposed by society and economy, are now co-opted by and incorporated into capitalism. As repressive desublimation offers a reprieve from superegoic demands, Marcuse argues, social conscience is relaxed, not only in relation to the subject's own conduct, but in relation to social wrongs and ills tout court. They are no longer registered as such. Why? Less repression leads to a less demanding superego, which means less conscience, which in an individualistic, unemancipated society means less ethical political concern across the board and less appetite for social knowledge. Put the other way around, instinctual repression takes work, including the work of the intellect. And when late capitalist desublimation relaxes demands for repression without freeing the subject or society, demands for intellection itself are reduced. Free, stupid, manipulable, absorbed by, if not addicted to trivial stimuli and gratifications, the subject of repressive desublimation is not just released to enjoy more pleasure, but released from conscience and comprehension across the board. Worse still, repressive desublimation unleashes new levels and forms of violence by opening the spigot of that other well of human instinct, thanatos, evident in the aggression spilling from the right, to some degree the left, amidst its frenzied affirmation of individual freedom. Let me take just 1 minute to gather these strands to offer a preliminary formulation of what I'm calling anti-democratic, authoritarian freedom today. We started with neoliberal reason's attack on the political by identifying politics with coercion and formulating freedom as only and always privately exercised, deregulated, and requiring expansion of the personal protected sphere. As principles and sentiments of the personal sphere are deployed against democratic inclusion, pluralism, tolerance, and equality, it challenges these, and not just market redistributions, as tyrannical social justice projects that trammel freedom. This expansion of the personal and this attack on the social eventually reaches to the nation itself, figuring the nation as privately owned rather than constituted by democratic citizenship. The owned nation has a double visage, that of a business that ought to make savvy deals and avoid giveaways, and that of a home in need of ever-increasing securitization in a dangerous world. Together, these legitimate internal and external illiberalism, authoritarianism, white nationalism, masculinism, and more. Freedom in this way literally becomes a weapon against the needful, the vulnerable, the historically excluded, and it also becomes perversely linked with growing strong statism. Nietzsche helped us see how this novel iteration of freedom is inflected by humiliation and nihilistic disorientation. Aggrieved by the socioeconomic displacements of neoliberalism and globalization, the reactive creature of a nihilistic age, with its desublimated will to power, is spurred to aggressions unfettered by concerns with truth, society, or the future. Nihilistic energies intensify the spirit of illiberalism. In neoliberalism's savaging of the social contract, these energies license the feelings, desires, and prejudices emanating from a deracinated, displaced, white male existence. Make America great again, France for the French, these barely bother to code themselves as more than that masculinist white supremacist last gasp or last grasp. But value slinging in a nihilistic age is not held to rigorous theological or philosophic standards. Marcuse's account of repressive desublimation added another angle. Unlike the conservative authority-oriented subject, oriented by conscience and closely identified with the rectitude of church and state, the new reactionary subject of repressive desublimation is generally indifferent to ethics or justice, malleable, manipulable, depleted of autonomy, moral self-restraint, and social comprehension. This subject is pleasure-mongering, aggressive, and again, perversely attached to the destruction and domination of its own milieu. Behold the aggrieved, reactive creature, fashioned by neoliberal reason and dethronement, embracing freedom without the social contract, authority without legitimacy, and vengeance without values. Far from the calculating, entrepreneurial, disciplined being imagined by Hayek and his kin, this creature is angry, uneducated, and aggressive, spurred by humiliation and thirst for revenge. The intensity of this energy is tremendous on its own, but it's also easily exploited by plutocrats, right-wing politicians, and tabloid media moguls whipping it up and keeping it stupid. It doesn't need to be gratified by policy that would produce its concrete betterment because it seeks mainly psychic anointment of its wounds. For the same reason, it can't be easily pacified. It's fueled by its rancor and its unavowed nihilistic despair. It can't be easily appealed to by reason because it doesn't want to know. It's unmotivated by consistency or depth in its values or by confidence in truth because it's steeped in nihilism's devaluation of both values and truth. Its conscience is weak while its own sense of victimization and persecution runs high. Can't be wooed by a viable alternative future because in that future it sees no place for itself. Its lost supremacy is unrestored even unmourned. The freedom it champions has gained credence as the needs, urges, and values of the private have become legitimate forms of public life and public expression. Having nothing to lose, its nihilism does not simply negate, but is festive, even apocalyptic, willing to take Britain over a cliff or put an unstable know-nothing in the most powerful position on earth. Why? Because it has nothing else. It probably cannot be reached or transformed, but it also has no end game. Still, have we any idea what to do with it? Can the remains of liberal democracy, let alone a more radical future democracy, possibly survive it? Thank you.
I would like to thank Wendy Brown for her inspiring and thought-provoking speech. Thank you, Wendy. So our second speaker tonight is Hartmut Rosa. I will say only very few words as an introduction, and then call him on the lectern. Hartmut Rosa is Professor of General and Theoretical Sociology at the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena. In 2006, he received the Research Prize for Basic Research in the state of Thuringia. Since October 2013, Hartmut Rosa has been director of the Max Weber Colleague for Cultural and Social Science Studies at the University of Erfurt. Hartmut Rosa has been the spokesman for the DFG, a funded research group Landing Acceleration Activation, at the University of Jena, and in 2016 he received the Tractatus Prize, if I spell it rightly. A very short overview of his work. Sociological and modern theoretical studies are the basis of his conceptualization of social acceleration. The technical or economically induced acceleration is reflected in the rapid development of technology in the 19th and 20th centuries. The history of modernity is at the same time the history of acceleration. Because of the time gained through technical progress, there is a shortage of time and no time gain. The formation of mobilization resources is another theme in his work. And according to Hartmut Rosa, identification with the state, my country, creates a moral obligation to ensure that this state is acting properly. He also focuses on the meta-theory of social sciences from the historical perspective. He calls for an analysis of political theories regarding their content and their activities. This means the investigation of tradition and discussion, as well as normative or ideological implications, in which he sees the central concern of a critical conceptual history. Hartmut Rosa is looking for new connections between contemporary social theory and time-critical analysis and a normative critical social philosophy based on the combination of political, identity, and modern theoretical considerations. Some of his monographs: Identity and Cultural Practice, Political Philosophy according to Charles Taylor; Acceleration, the Change of the Temporal Structures in Modernity; Sociology, Capitalism, Criticism, a Debate; World Relations in the Age of Acceleration; and the recent one, Resonance, a Sociology of the World. Having said that, I will call Hartmut Rosa onto the lectern. Hartmut.
Thank you very much, Mr. Papadopoulos, for this kind introduction, and to Frank Wales and the other organizers for inviting me and giving me the chance to present to you my ideas of sociology. But thanks a lot, of course, to all of you for still staying here. I'm really impressed, because it's been a very long and a hot day and a long and a hot week, and it's even now a long session. So I appreciate it very much that you are all still here, and I also appreciated the presentation by Wendy Brown very much, because I think she just has given us a whole set of good reasons to see that what we are trying to do here as sociologists right now in Athens, but generally it's deadly important. I really believe so, right? It's about the form of life we live in and about the future, and I understand this conference also to be about the role we want to play as sociologists in the world, in the fate of our form of life. So I want to use the 30 minutes I've been given to somehow point out the picture to you I have of what sociology could be and what we should aspire to do really. And actually I like to play around, to fuss around with the PowerPoint, so let's see whether this works. Not yet, maybe I have to turn it on. Oh yeah, no, it's on. Oh, something happened. Okay. So let me see. So this does not work. Maybe this does work. This doesn't work. Oh, it's.
Can I help you?
Yeah. Oh, now it's working. It's working. It's working. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So you see, I used this for a long time, right? It's this. This is my image. It's the Motorhead cover from Orgasmatron, right? It's a rock album, and for me, I use it as a symbol for the dynamic power of what I still think we should call modernity. Modernization is about setting the world in motion, dynamizing it, accelerating it, producing material growth and so on. And it's a kind of an engine, it's a system, it's a systemic structure, but it's also connected to desire, even to lust. That's the Motorhead album is called Orgasmatron, right? But I think there is a different aspiration or inspiration in modernity, which I try to capture with a notion of resonance in my latest book, and I will point out or try to demonstrate what I understand or what I mean by this a bit later on right now. So as I said, I think we have already used this conference also as a kind of frame, an institution where we think about what kind of sociology we want to do and what sociology can aspire to do. And since I'm a social theorist, and actually I have a weakness, I fall for grand theory, right? But I still think, and I think you've just given us good reasons, that as sociologists we should still strive to somehow get the big picture, right? Probably we will never get it, but at least we should try to do it, right? So I still believe that we need at least to try to give a comprehensive account of what society is, right? Kind of in contrast to the famous Margaret Thatcher dictum, there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals and families. I'm deeply convinced that there is something like society as a social formation, a kind of totality. I mean, we know that it's very difficult to talk about totality in this sense, but it's a kind of form of life which is governed by a social logic, which is a kind of formational logic, right? So I believe that the idea, or that we should strive as sociologists to understand, to analyze the social formation we live in as in total. Of course, the we is also a problem here, but since I only have 30 minutes, I'll leave it aside for a second and move to the second requirement, I believe. This is very important. I think if we want to understand, to analyze the social formation we live in, I still like to call it modernity. And I actually believe it's very important if we give up concepts like society and modernity, and if we claim that there are only social arrangements of forms of socialization and so on, then we really lose the chance to understand, to analyze, and to diagnose, to criticize the life form as in total, like something like capitalist society. But in order to understand to analyze the social formation or society, I believe it's deadly important to see that we need a dual perspective. It's a perspective, right? I call the structural perspective, or what I like most is a term you can get by Charles Taylor or Alan Ryan, or in the philosophy of the social sciences. We need a third-person perspective on society, and that means we need an analysis of society, of the social framework we live in, which resembles the way we analyze planets, or in the natural sciences. We look at it from the outside, like what Marx did in the Capital, right? Looking at the institutional and structural logic of society. So that's the third person perspective. It's a perspective on society. But I believe that we cannot just leave it at that. We need to complement it through a first-person perspective or account of society. And I think this is why the ESA conference here has the subjectivities in its title and the topics, right? We need a first-person perspective, a first-person account of the desires and the fears and the anxieties that is kind of filling the institutional framework with the vitality and the energy. You cannot understand a form of life, a social formation, if you do not understand the self-interpretations of social actors, the desires and the fears that are driving them. And now the point is, of course, does not mean going back to the old dichotomies between structure and action, or culture and structure, and so on. Because the two are always tightly related. In the end, actually, what I tried to do in my latest books is come up with a kind of relational ontology. My idea is that it's not that you have subjects on the one hand and society or the world on the other hand, or systems, and then you see how the two relate. It's the other way around, right? We have the relationships at first. That's why my new book in German is called Soziologie der Weltbeziehung, a sociology of self-world relations. But the nice thing with the German term is that I don't need the self in here, because selves are difficult, right? But it's about relationships. So I believe it's relationships which come first, but then they produce subjectivities and systemic institutional structures. So we have to have a dual perspective, first-person perspective, third-person perspective, and to see how they fit together. And thirdly, and this is another, I know it's not an easy claim, you might not be happy with it, but I think as sociologists we should strive to do three things in analyzing or in giving an account of the social formation. First, we have to have an analysis on both counts, right? What is the institutional logic of the society we live in? What are the subjectivities created, the desires, the anxieties, and the fears? A cultural analysis. Then I believe we had that in the discussion yesterday with Maggie Abraham and Frank Welz about what sociology should aspire to. And I think there is widespread agreement here, certainly we could also hear it from Wendy Brown, that sociology or social theory, social philosophy, intrinsically has a kind of critical attitude or critical bite. I really tried to, I have written a few articles trying to claim that a critical perspective, social critique, is intrinsic to sociology. It's not an optional feature which we can then also do after analyzing. I believe that the critical stance is intrinsic to what sociology should be or could be or actually always was. So the second task is what I call diagnosis. I know these medical terms are very dangerous actually, that's why I put them in the quotation marks. Nevertheless, we have to have a critical analysis on both counts. What's the problem with the institutional system we live in, and what's the problem with the cultural aspirations or the subjectivities produced thereby or produced in intertwinement. But thirdly, and this of course is also controversial, but I liked a lot of discussions here, as I said, Maggie Abraham yesterday also made the point that people out there in society in the end might get tired of listening to us sociologists always criticizing society. We've done that for 200 years, making the point that capitalism is really bad in many respects, because that immediately triggers the question, okay, you're right, if you are convincing, then people will tell us. Actually, that was my personal experience when I wrote the acceleration book. I talked to many audiences, and fortunately, very often people said, yes, we get the point about acceleration, so how should we do it differently? What do we do instead? And if we then always throw up our hands in despair, saying, well, we don't provide solutions, we don't even think about it, we only criticize, then people say, okay, then let's turn elsewhere. So I really believe it is part of our existential challenge Not to provide the perfect solutions, but to develop out of the analysis and the diagnosis possible ways, so to speak, immanent transcendence of what solutions could be like. To call that therapy, I know, is a bit, is of course controversial. So, but what I want to do in the remaining 25 minutes or so, 20 minutes, okay, is this. This is, I certainly do not have enough time to develop the full picture. I just want to point it out and to kind of sketch it to you, because I tried, and I still try, to really spell it out. It cannot be enough to always do meta theory. Actually, I consider myself to be a critical theorist in the critical theory camp. But I think critical theory has one problem over the last decades. There was always reflection about how critical theory should be done or could be done, but they never criticize society. I mean, they never get to the point where they really give. At least I thought that's a problem with it. So I really want to do it, and I know we all know that it's kind of idiotic to even try to. But okay, let's try. Let's nevertheless try to do it. So we have to have 6, so to speak. I will move now in 6 points, and I will start. Oh, yes, with this, right. So my claim is that we have to understand the modern or the late modern. I don't have the time to develop my distinction between late modern and modern. Late modernity is just another stage in the process of modernization. But I believe that modernity as such can be understood and should be understood with this definition, right? A society can be called modern when its mode of stabilization is dynamic. That means when it systematically requires material growth, technological acceleration, cultural innovation in order to reproduce its institutional and structural status quo. Right? I'm not sure whether this sounds difficult or not, but the idea is simple. A modern society, in my view, can be defined by the fact that it needs to increase. It needs permanently to accelerate, grow, innovate in order to stay as it is. Now, of course, that's a kind of paradoxical formulation, but the point is that it needs increase for its institutional reproduction, right? If you want to keep the economic system, the companies and the jobs, you see this in Greece here, right? You need economic growth, for example, right? But without growth, you have a problem in the political system. The budget is getting into deficit. You get a problem with the welfare system. You can study all of this in Greece, and we have discussed it in many sessions here, right? If you do not manage to increase your productivity and so on, basically if you don't get the accumulation process of capital going, then you cannot really maintain the institutional structure, the status quo. You get in crisis, right? The story is very easy. If you don't get growth, if you don't achieve growth, you lose jobs, companies close down, the budget is getting into deficit, you cannot maintain the welfare system, the health system, the educational system. That leads to delegitimization of the political system, and you're basically in bad trouble. That's the very easy story of dynamic stabilization. Of course, it has a lot to do with capitalism, right? You get it very easy from the Marxian formula, money, commodity, money, prime. Right? I mean, it's really easy to see in the economic realm. It means economic activity is only going on, it's only triggered, money is only invested, or capital is only invested, if there is a prospect of getting more money out of it, right? Money, prime. But for me personally, it's important to see that this logic of dynamic stabilization is not only in the economic realm. I think when you look at science and knowledge, you find the same logic. I find this really, that's my own formula: knowledge, research, more knowledge, right? That's the defining formula of science, right? Science is not preserving or reproducing knowledge or treasuring it, handing it down from one generation to the next. Science is about permanently pushing the border. If you want to be a scientist, you have to promise that you push the border of knowledge, making more knowledge, knowledge prime. And you find the same logic in the political system. If you want to be, it's not that you're a king once and forever. You have to be re-elected every 4 years. That's dynamic stabilization. And how do you get re-elected? Through political competition. And that competition is won through making promises of increase. Vote for me and you will have more jobs. Vote for me and I will promise you will have higher incomes. Vote for me and you will have more kindergarten places or hospital beds or whatever it is. It's the logic of increase that even stabilizes and reproduces the political structure. So this is feature number one. A modern society institutionally, third-person perspective, is defined through the permanent need for increase in order to keep the form you have, the institutional status quo. Now, what is very important is that that acceleration, growth, and innovation cannot be produced by the structures or by the institutions. It needs the subjects which come up with innovations. It needs subjects who speed up. It's all of us who have to speed up next year. If you think that you are very pressed for time this year, or you're short on time and you think I can't take any more, well, the bad news is next year you have to run faster. This is really, that's the logic of dynamic stabilization. So the question is, why do we do it? And we in the sense of all of us. And now, I mean, so my claim here really is why we have to turn to subjectivities. It's the subjects who have to innovate, accelerate, and produce growth. So why do we do it? Why do they do it? And I think there are two answers to this. One very obviously is fear. It's the logic of competition, of losing out. If you do not work on self-optimization, right? If you don't run faster next year, you lose out in economic and social competition. But nevertheless, I'm deeply convinced that this cannot explain the strength, the stamina, so to speak, of modernity. A system like the modern social formation, the capitalist modern formation, cannot live alone on anxiety and fear. It needs to have, like Boltanski and Capello have made that point very forcefully too, right? It has to give, to come at least with a certain promise, with a kind of inspirational energy. So what is this inspirational energy? And I call this the AAA conception of the good life. I like triple A's, right? So that's because it's nice to play with the words. So my idea here is that subjects in a modern subject, so to speak, you can almost define it in that sense, right, is also driven by the desire to increase the horizon of what is available, of what is attainable and accessible. And actually, you can do the self-test, whether it's true for you, right? My claim is that, of course, we do not have most of us don't have an elaborate description of what a good life is, right? Actually, it's very interesting. If you ask people what is a good life for you, you get answers which are not very satisfactory. But I think you can really show by empirical social analysis that the decisions we make in our life, in everyday practices and in the big areas of life, they very often, almost invariably, follow the logic of increasing the horizon of the available, the attainable, and the accessible. That's the AAA approach. What do I mean by it? Well, it's easy. Think about why is money attractive for us? Now you can say, who is us? I don't like money, maybe you don't. But most subjects in modern societies, for different reasons, are attracted, for example, to money. And why is money interesting? We can learn this from Simmel and from others. Because money is really the tool with which you make the world, you can appropriate the world, right? I would really claim that your bank account gives you a very clear figure, a very clear definition of how far your horizon of the available and the attainable and the accessible is. If you're very rich or you win in the lottery, then Tokyo and Rio and New York get into the horizon of the accessible. You can go shopping there over the weekend. And if you're really rich, you can cruise on a yacht wherever you want to, right? Or you can go skiing in the Antarctic or at the North Pole or somewhere else. So you bring the world within your reach through money in all spheres of life almost, right? So and if you're very poor, if your bank account is in the negative already, then maybe even Rome is no longer within reach. You cannot afford getting there, or Thessaloniki, or maybe even Piraeus if you're really poor. If you don't have money, the horizon of the available, the attainable, and the accessible is very, very narrow. But I think you can always also explain why technology is so important and successful in modern society. I really like, at this point, I like really the story of mobility. I don't know whether you still remember when you got your first bike, but maybe you remember when your kids get their first bike and learn how to cycle. Why is that a great moment in life? Because once you can ride a bike, it increases the horizon of what is available and accessible and attainable to you. It really, I call it in German, Weltreichweite. Your world, the horizon of the available increases. And then if you're 15 and you can cycle the moped, the world increases again, and you dream of becoming 18 in Germany, 16 in the US, because then you can have a car and go to New York or wherever you live, right? The horizon increases, and with a plane, London and Tokyo get within reach, right? And it's the same with the smartphones. Why is a smartphone attractive? So terribly attractive that even the sociologists who always claim it's a bad machine, they all have it. Well, because it makes all of your friends, all the knowledge, all the music, all the information available, attainable, accessible in your pockets, right? In your bodies. So, and my final argument to convince you of this point, why do most subjects in modern society want to live in big cities? I mean, one answer can be on the fear side, right? Because they don't have a job or so. They have opportunities. But very often, if you talk to younger persons, why do you want to move to Berlin or New York? Oh, because there I have the opera, I have the musical, I have the universities and so on. Maybe they never go to the opera, but it is within reach, right? The number of things you have available, attainable, accessible is much higher than what you have at the countryside. So I could go on this point forever, but I only have 12 minutes or so. So let's move to the third part. What's wrong with this, right? In my book, I mean, of course, the dynamic stabilization part, I try to develop in my book on social acceleration very excessively, and also in my new book on resonance. And now the question is, what's possibly wrong with it? An institutional diagnosis. How should I criticize such a system? There, my answer is that actually the logic of dynamization creates a very uneven world, because not everything is speedable or dynamizable. It can be dynamized to the same extent. And the faster things, those groups of people, those areas which can accelerate at a faster pace, systematically put pressure on the slow things, right? So it leads to desynchronization in many areas of life. And my claim was that the big crisis of our present social formation can be explained as crisis of desynchronization. For example, the ecological crisis I was really surprised when I tried to do it, how easily you can really claim that the ecological problems are caused by the fact that the proper time of nature, or the reproduction cycle of nature, are too slow for the speed of social life, right? So we cut down trees at a pace which is too high. We fish the oceans at a pace which is too high. We pollute the air at a pace which is too high for nature, for the natural reproduction of the system. Actually, global warming, in fact, chemically, global warming is speeding up the molecules in the atmosphere. It's making them go faster because of the heat we need to produce social acceleration on Earth. So I really believe the ecological problem can be redefined, redescribed as a desynchronization between the speed of nature, the proper time of nature, and the proper time of our techno-material reproduction on Earth. But I even believe, or I think it's very interesting to look at the democratic crisis you were talking about in temporal perspective. There you see that democracy, it's not about saying yes or no. It's not just about a referendum. Democracy is a process of deliberation, right? Of getting in touch with others, making your voice heard and reacting to the voices and the positions of others. And as society becomes more complex and more pluralistic, it needs more time to organize the democratic process of will formation and decision making. But since the markets speed up, and the media, by the way, communication speed up also, you get a serious desynchronization between the proper time, the logic of democracy, and the proper time, the logic of the markets and the economic and technological development. So there's desynchronization on that count. I leave the economic desynchronization aside. And that's the idea that there's a desynchronization between the speed of financial markets and the so-called real material economy. And finally, you also have desynchronization, I believe, maybe on the psychological side, what in former times was called the soul or the psyche, might have a proper time too. It takes time to appropriate the world, to get in touch with people, to make yourself at home in a certain place. And maybe that kind of temporality is desynchronized against social temporality too, and might lead to something like a burnout. So on the institutional side, what we experience or what we can observe is desynchronization. And the last point already hinted at what I think is the problem on the cultural side, alienation, right? I just said maybe society has become too fast for the psychic system, for our soul, however you want to like it, however you want to call it. But here I think the term provided in the history of social philosophy is alienation, no longer being able to appropriate the world in a deeper and meaningful form, right? So my claim is that that actually the AAA approach to the world in a context of dynamic stabilization has a kind of flip side, which is the maybe even the loss of the capacity to truly appropriate the world, to get the world to speak to you, if you so like, right? So I define alienation as a mode of being in the world, or you could also say of relating to the world, in which there is no internal, vibrant relationship with the world. My colleague Rahel Yegi says alienation is a non-relational relationship. It's a relationship where you don't feel internally attached or connected, right? So the claim here is that you operate in a world, you function in it, but you lose the capacity to appropriate it, to get it speak to you, to feel attached to it. I will point out in a second more how I think the problem with the term alienation in sociology is that we could not say what a non-alienated world looks like. And that's where my conception of resonance kicks in, and I have 6 more minutes for that. I just want to point out that I think this flip side, I said modernity is culturally driven by the idea to increase the horizon of the available, the attainable, and the accessible. But also internally, there always was the darkest, the biggest fear of modernity, that somehow, paradoxically, we might lose the world. It might become silent and deaf and dead and pale and gray. It's what led Marx to develop the concept of alienation, the early Marx. What gets Weber to speak of disenchantment? The world stops to sing. Right? That's the literal meaning of disenchantment. Or in Lukács and later on even in Honneth, reification. It's a wrong way of relating to things and to people and even to ourselves. It's the kind of having only an instrumental, a causal relationship. And I believe if you look at this dark side of modernity, losing the capacity to really appropriate the world, making it speak to you, making it resonate, right, is even present, you can discern it in Durkheim's anomia or in Simmel's conception of the blasé attitude or in Camus' idea of how absurdity gets born or in Hannah Arendt's conception of losing the world because losing the capacity to politically connect and act with other people. So finally, what are the solutions? I said, I really believe we have to at least develop out of analysis and diagnosis the idea of where could we go from here. And I believe if dynamic stabilization is the problem leading to desynchronization, we need a different form of stabilization. And that certainly cannot be static stabilization. Just to stay as we are is not a good idea. It's totally impossible in the social world, maybe in the world at all. So I call the alternative mode, which we should try to get to, adaptive stabilization, right? A form of stabilizing society which is capable of innovation, acceleration, and growth when there is the need for a change in the status quo, what we call development or so on. But it's a form of stabilization which doesn't permanently need to increase just to stay as it is. In Jena, we work on this project on a post-growth society in our consortium with Klaus Dörre and Stefan Lessenich. And a lot of the people are here, like Sebastian Sevignani, Hanna Ketterer, Silke van Dijk, a lot of people working on this. And the idea is that we need economic, political, and cultural change in order to achieve this. So, of course, we're still far away from getting there, but the idea is to develop something like an idea of what another form of society could look like. And this brings me to my very last point. I've written a book of about 800 pages on the resonance conception, and I have 4 more minutes for this. So the question here is, as I said, the problem with alienation is that it's very hard to say what is the opposite of alienation. How can you describe a non-alienated form of being in the world, which is also an answer or which is an alternative to the AAA approach to the world, right? Or AAA approach of another form of subjectivity. And now, my idea here is that when you look at the history of modernity and even at the history of critical theory, right? I mean, if you look at critical theory, then all of those critical theorists from Marx, I kind of consider him in that line of thought, right? To, like, let's say, Honneth or Habermas, they all have this deep worry of reification, instrumental reason, one-dimensionality, alienation, and so on. And they have a very vague idea that that a different mode of existence is possible, a different way of being in the world, of relating to the world. For Adorno, it was a mimetic relationship to the world. For Marcuse, whom you talked about already, it actually was the idea that it should be possible to have an erotic way of being in the world, which is not just sexual, it's a different way of relating to the world. So what I try to do is think of what could a mimetic, erotic, auratic, charismatic way of being in the world look like? And here is my answer. And we all know it because I believe that resonance is a core, it's an existential element without which no subjectivities can ever be produced. Subjects are already kind of the result of subtle forms of resonance. So what is resonance? Resonance is a mode of being in touch with something other. And I was wondering when I was listening to you about the nihilism, I really want to claim, I really believe the nihilism you were describing is the result of the loss of our capacity to hear a call, which would be Bruno Latour's term, right? Being called upon by something out there. And I'm sure, I know, all of you know this experience, that you encounter something or someone. Could be an idea, could be a mountain, could be music, could be whatever it is, something or someone that speaks to you. When all of a sudden you feel that's the first element, affection. I write it with an arrow because it means something affects me. Or Bruno Latour would say something calls on me. I hear a call. There's something that moves me, that touches me intrinsically. It's not something that I do out of myself. It's something speaking to me. I saw his or her eyes and something happened. Or I heard that voice. Or I heard that melody. Or I saw that sight. Or I read that book. It can be many, many forms. And very often it's in work. I encountered this problem, and all of a sudden I was affected. I felt that I was addressed. I heard a voice, so to speak. And that's the first element of resonance. Something affects me. And the second element is I answer, right? That's why I write it with an emovere, moving outwards, answering to it. Whenever you are touched by someone or something, by a person you encounter, by a music you hear, by a book you read, you react to it. You start thinking, you reach outward. If it's a person, then you immediately know what it means being in resonance. It's not only that you are touched, it's I saw that I also reached the other side, right? That I had an effect there. Self-efficacy is the second core element. I feel also actively connected with the other world. I feel myself effective. So feeling powerless, of course, is one reason why people no longer feel in resonance. But the third element, vitally important, is that in this process of getting into resonance with someone or something, you transform. And that's why you don't stay the same, and that's why resonance is not harmony, and it's not reaffirming identity. Because resonance means you encounter some other, and by getting into resonance with it, it's not only being overwhelmed. Being overwhelmed can be one element, but then you answer it, you feel self-efficacy. And in that process, you transform. That's what people always say when you do biographic interviews, right? People always tell their biography by saying, and then I met that person, or I read that book, or I heard that music, and after that, I was a different person. right? There was this element of resonance. It can happen with a theory, right? You encounter a theory, and after that your worldview and even your subjectivity is somehow transformed. So the third element of resonance is transformation. You transform, and also on the other side, actually, there's transformation on the world side, but that gets us into epistemological problems I don't want to get into right now. Just the last element. I believe this is very important, because that's, I think, where my critique of modernity or the capitalist modernity really points to. Resonance always has a moment of, I call it in German, Unverfügbarkeit. In English, we could call it elusiveness. You can never make sure, there is no institutional or instrumental guarantee that resonance will happen. Right? You buy the most expensive tickets for a concert of your favorite singer, and you go there and nothing happens. Right? You try to convince yourself that it was a deep experience, but very likely, or at least possibly, nothing really happened. So you cannot make sure that resonance occurs, right? And what is even worse, or what's even better in my view, is that you cannot tell the result of what happens with you and the other side if you get in resonance with someone or something. Right? If the process of resonance starts, you're transformed in a way that you cannot know in advance. So therefore, I believe being in a resonant mode with the world is in contrast, is in contradiction with the modern logic of increasing availability, attainability, and accessibility in that easy sense. And just to make my main point once more, I think resonance is a way out. It's not harmony. If you know the Trumpians or the Brexiters, or in Germany the AfD people, I think they yearn for a kind of resonance, but what they get is only echo, because they don't encounter some other. They really don't want to hear some other or something other that transforms them. They want to have the same, and to kind of get off a fusion where they don't hear their own voice nor another voice. And certainly it doesn't have the element of transformation. Resonance, in my conception, has this necessary element of transformation, and that's why it's not identity, but it's not just on the different side of this dichotomy. I believe it's a kind of bridge between conceptions of identity and conceptions of difference. So this is the full picture, my 6 steps towards hopefully a better world. Thanks a lot for listening. Thank you.
I would like to thank Hartmut Rosa for his critical reflections on late modernity, and for creating a lot of allowing us to look at the critical angle, very different critical angles of late modernity. I hate that we have to finish very, very soon. We can only take 1 or 2 short comments, because we are in 5 minutes. We have to close the session and leave this conference room. If there are any 1 or 2 questions, very short, we can take them. Are there? Cannot see very well. One's there. One. Somebody with the... okay. And the second question here, okay? After, okay? We take both of them, and then we'll have your reactions.
Hi. I have a question for Professor Brown. Okay. Sorry. My question takes its clue from Catherine Hall's idea that in order to understand national context, we have to look outside it. And it was Stuart Hall that in 2011 has this argument that liberalism has its roots in colonialism. And I was wondering, since you proposed a very powerful analysis of contemporary nihilism behind right-wing populism and right-wing politics, whether colonialism and the experience of colonialism might help understanding contemporary right-wing politics. Especially, you know, the hyper-racism that is growing, and the frustration of the white male that you also stressed. The colonial state and the colonial ideology might be also behind what you propose. And I was thinking about Fanon as a possible another author which could help understanding the frustration and the sublimation that you were talking about.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm actually the importance of colonialism in your analysis.
Okay, thank you very much. The second question here at the front. Can we have the microphone, please? Here, at the front. Okay. Please try to keep it very short, okay? I said it since the very beginning.
Yes, so
Time is
I
limited.
very much enjoyed your talk, Hartmut Rosa. And I have to give you a compliment for having the courage to spell out the therapy for all that's wrong with the present societies and for the present modernization, which continues at an alarming pace. And you were talking about adaptive stabilization, and you mentioned post-growth societies. And I'm just curious as to how these post-growth societies can keep societies stable and can also stabilize the legitimacy of the political system. How can you ensure that, so that we are actually all, still supportive of democracy when there's no further growth? So,
Okay,
question to you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Very, very quickly. So I was not attempting to offer a comprehensive account of our times, but one particular line into the libertarian authoritarian formation that I think characterizes a good deal of right-wing reaction today. There is no question that colonialism contributes to this in several ways. Briefly, part of the upheavals in the world producing crises of movements, unwanted movements by millions and millions of people that are adding to pressures in the metropole. Part of that is the aftermath of colonialism. Certainly the nativism that is at stake in a lot of this right-wing reaction is drawing on a colonialist, and in the case of my country, a kind of hyper-colonialist disavowal of the fact that the whites are not the natives. And certainly there is also an antipathy toward concern with the rest of the world at a highly globalized moment. The America First mantra, the France for the French mantra, all of the right-wing parties, Brexit, Germany, etc., are rejecting obligations, conscience, orientation toward global cooperation, global conscience, global caring, international human rights, and so forth. So all of those things are at stake. The last thing I'll say is that not iterating that wasn't just a matter of trying to stay within 30 minutes and failing. It was also that I am trying to get at the particular conjuncture of neoliberalism and globalization in producing a particular formation of reaction. You're reminding me that I can't strip it back to neoliberalism, that I actually have to acknowledge a series of other things at work in producing libertarian, authoritarian, nationalist reactions. So I take the point.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. It's very important, obviously, and I must say that of all my 6 boxes, I find this the hardest, right? What is the structure, the institutional structure of a post-growth society? I mean, one thing I'm pretty sure about, or I'm firm about, is that post-growth for me does not mean it never grows or accelerates. It just means it doesn't have to keep the structure, right? And it also seems obvious to me, or to us also in Jena, that under the current form of capitalist economies, it's kind of impossible to achieve that, right? Even if I believe, or we believe now in Jena, that capitalism can probably survive without growth, but then it still has all the pressures for increase in acceleration and innovation, for example, and increase in productivity on the other side. So we need a kind of economic revolution or reform, which I would call kind of economic democracy, right? And but we also need a kind of reform of the current welfare state system. And there I'm a strong believer in an unconditional basic income, because I really believe that would take the anxiety out of the kind of the social fabric in a certain way. But the complete institutional picture I don't yet have, because we are kind of working in a corporate project there. But what I'm also, my last point on this is, what I tried to do so far is really to say that if you want to call it capitalism or the growth logic, is not just out there in the structures. It is in the structures, but it's also inside us, right? Capitalism is not just out there, the bad capitalists or the bad capital and the good subjects. It's also in our subjectivities. So that's why I want to say, if we want to overcome it, we need a kind of a reorientation also in the cultural realm, in the very nature of our fabric of our subjectivities. And that's where I believe, I hope I made a step with the resonance theory, right? So that's at least, that's the stage we are in right now. Thank you.
Thank you, both of our distinguished guests, for the presentations and for the answer the questions. A big applause for the people. I think that more questions can be addressed to both of them after we finish this plenary. You may stay. I would like to call on stage the president of ESA, Frank Welch, to thank him. Please, Frank, to thank him for his collaboration. Thank you. We collaborated for 2 years, and I would like to give him a small present. Christian Fuchs is here. Christian? Oh, we'd like to thank you very much for the collaboration. He is the chair of the conference, of the ESA conference, of the theme. Thank you very much for collaborating and for working with us for the last 2 years. Thank you. This is for you. Let's keep it. Okay. And I would like to call Dagmar Danko. Is she here? Yeah. Thank you very much. I have another for Christian, okay? Thank you very much. It was really good working with these people in the last day, for the last years. There are 2 more people I would like to call. The rector of Pandion University is Mini Kriari. Is he among us? Yes. Thank you very much for working with us and for making it possible. Okay? This is for Ismini. It's not the same present we show to everyone. There are different presents. Okay? And a similar one is for the rector of Harokopio University, the two rectors who made this organization possible. She cannot attend this. She couldn't attend this plenary because she had an accident long before the Congress. So you should be sure I will give it to her. And finally, I will call on stage some of the people that work very hard in the last months, especially in the last weeks, very hard in the last days. This is all. I will call all the names at one after the other, and I hope all of them are here. Despina Papadopoulou, Christina Karakiouliafi, Christina, Χριστίνα Καρακιουλάφη, Γιώργος Μαυρομάτης. Christina is not here. Θανάσης Λακριντής. Λουκία Μαρία Φρατσέα. And Αλέκα Θεοφίλη. A big applause for everyone. And over 250 volunteers. We wouldn't believe that we would mobilize so many volunteers, since they know that we all say in Greece we have a weak civil society. We have a strong society, but it depends on the challenges each time. So when people have challenges, they respond to them, and we thank you all of them for working with us. All the members of the ESA executive and the members of the LOC, of the Athens LOC, many of them are here. I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart all of them. And we will all see each other in the next conference in Paris, if I remember well. See you all there. And thanks for participating and staying for so late. You all know that there is a farewell party upstairs. Should allow for half an hour or something to prepare everything, and the people who are going there, I'm sure they will have a good time. Greece is not only a place of thinking and of problems, it's also a place where people have also fun without forgetting their problems and without forgetting that they have to contribute all the time. Thank you all for being here.